Unsiloed podcast is produced by University FM, elevating the stories of your institution.
Welcome to Unsiloed. This is Greg LeBlanc, and I'm here today with Des Fitzgerald, who is a professor of medical humanities and social sciences at University College Cork in Ireland, also the author of this book here. It's called The Living City, Why Cities Don't Need to Be Green to Be Great. And it's got a different title in England, which is The City of Today is a Dying Thing, which I believe is a quote from Corbusier. And a lot of the book actually goes back to the days when people first started formulating all of these ideas around how the city shapes us, right? I mean, we could quote Churchill at this point, right? Where, we shape the cities and the cities shape us. But I think that the main thrust of the book is that you have a problem with what we might think of as what used to be called the Garden City movement, and which has sort of its own modern manifestations, right? This notion that we need to bring more nature into the city. And what's interesting about this movement is that it crosses all political lines. I mean, there is a conservative side to this whole movement, which Roger Scruton, I think, was one of the folks who was advocating this. And then you also have a very strong progressive aspect to this, right? Which is all about planting as many trees as possible. And so it's kind of one of those few things that we see in the modern world where across the board, everybody can agree on this, except maybe for you.
Yeah.
So we'll have to
come along and be like,
yeah.
I mean, it's true that it's a gift to have written a book that really no one is going to agree with, right? Now, typically, you'll have at least one constituency you can say, that's who the people are writing for. But I mean, the interest for me, the excitement for me, was to try and think seriously and critical about a thing that we're just not critical about at all, and that is green urbanism, right? That is the kind of assumption that whatever else we think about the city of the future, however we think about what it looks like physically or how housing is going to be organized or how urban economies are going to be organized, that it has to be green. And the book is kind of an attempt to think critically and a bit carefully about that and think, maybe not, right?
Well,
should I say a bit before I come into that, maybe?
Yeah, well, maybe we can go back to the beginning, all right? Because, I mean, there are folks like Frederick Law Olmsted and Ebenezer Howard, right? These were some of the people that originally formulated this notion that there was something wrong with cities, that cities were somehow damaging people, right? I mean, look, we there's all sorts of literature in the Victorian period about how the factory is bad for people. And these factory towns and coal mines and, the textile mills were satanic and destroying people. But there is this broader notion that the city in general should be thought of as a tumor on the earth. I forget who said that, right? It was, a parasite or something that seemed fundamentally unnatural and harmful to people. And maybe that is sort of the origin of this idea of environmental psychology, that we our nature or our dispositions and happiness and well-being are affected by our environment, and that the city is a bad one. When did this first start?
So I think that the discussion we're having today kind of inherits two parallel but distinctive debates from the second half of the 19th century. And the first is the one you just gestured to, which is happening especially in North America, but also in England and in Germany and other bits of industrializing Europe. And that's a kind of generalized anxiety about what cities are doing to people, right? A kind of, on the one hand, a kind of a predictable kind of health anxiety about sanitation in the city, about overcrowding, about disease and those sorts of things. But also a kind of more subtle kind of moral anxiety, that sense that like suddenly, and this is quite a sudden and recent thing at this point, suddenly you have all these people, mostly from quite impoverished backgrounds, mostly from kind of quite, rural, not highly educated, parts of the world, suddenly corralled together in these very small spaces. And a real anxiety about what that is doing to people, as we would think psychologically, but as they thought at the time, morally, like what kind of people were being produced in these very new spaces. And so that becomes a big topic of kind of public anxiety and a focus for kind of moral reform, especially in England in the second half of the 19th century. And so the Garden City movement is playing heavily on that. So really what the Garden City movement is trying to do is to get people out of these cities, partly for kind of benign reasons to do with health and access to green space and all the things we'll think of, but also very explicitly to produce better kinds of people, right? To produce kind of like fitter, stronger, less prone to drink, less near the pubs, kind of more outdoorsy kind of people who would be better workers, better soldiers, that sort of thing. So that's a big discourse that's happening in the second half, especially the late 19th century into the 20th. But there's an older kind of discourse as well, which is really where I come in, and that's a discourse about urban mental health. And you really get that from kind of the beginning of the 19th century. So, I kind of say this, I realize I keep saying this and I don't know if it's actually true, but I'm going to say it again anyway, which is that, psychiatric epidemiology kind of broadly crystallizes first half of the 19th century. And really what it crystallizes around is one particular finding. And that finding is that wherever, let's say it crystallizes around the formation of the first asylums, which means you can do the first kind of population studies on mental health patients. And the kind of originary finding is that, there's something about either growing up or moving to a city that seems to have some association with the development of psychosis, melancholia, all kinds of, multiple kinds of mental health problems. And that's a kind of a conversation that tracks through the 19th century, well into the 20th without resolution. You have these kind of debates about kind of social drift and social causation and all those kinds of things. And it's only really in the last 20 years or so that there's some kind of consensus, or at least public consensus, that maybe we have finally resolved this issue. And that really what has been causing this mental health crisis, which we've known about in cities for 150 years, is an absence of nature. It's an absence of green stuff. It's people not having nature contacts, people not being around living things, that sort of thing. And so that's where those two kind of moral / psychological anxieties about the city, and then kind of let's say psychiatric epidemiological anxiety about mental health kind of converge, which I think is really where today we get that massive power of kind of green urbanism, and why it feels to us so, as you said at the beginning, so something that's so difficult to argue with, right? So whatever your kind of political perspective is otherwise, it seems to be the one kind of thing that, yes, obviously we should have more green stuff in cities. I think that's where the power of it comes from. It's those two long-standing discourses coming together.
Well, with respect to physical health, I mean, it's difficult to argue with data around life expectancy and vulnerability to infectious diseases. I mean, it does seem that for a big chunk of our history, urban living was bad for your physical health, right? And it's only been fairly recently that we've sort of seen, if there is such a thing as kind of an urban life expectancy premium or health benefit. But I think the mechanisms for that are relatively easy to understand. Disease transmission, and when you're talking about cholera and I don't know, these tuberculosis and stuff like that. But the psychological health one is maybe not immediately obvious, right? Because one would think that in the city you have more people around, you're less likely to be lonely and so forth. But I think you say that there is evidence presented by these psychological epidemiologists that says that there's more loneliness and there's more stress, and that while the city living is more exciting, the excitement comes at a price. I mean, that there are people today that are still looking at the data. Is that supported by the data? Is there any evidence to support this, or is this sort of something that?
No, this is well supported and robust, and I should say, especially as someone who's kind of, skeptical about a lot of this literature, and at least skeptical about how we're kind of thinking it through, maybe through policy spaces. I mean, I need to insist it is absolutely a robust and long-standing finding that there is something about urban life that for some people in certain kind of circumstances can produce a form of distress that does effloresce into something we could call a mental illness. That is, I think, unimpeachably the case. Why that is not super clear. I think the most accurate answer is going to be the most boring one, which is that it is some combination of stressors. And of course, stressors are different for different people. So something about noise, competition, what psychologists call social defeat, a range of possible phenomena that just preponderate in urban space. And you get enough of those stressors, maybe that attach to some kind of biological predisposition and a kind of an unfortunate life circumstance, and that will fluoresce into a mental health problem, right? And it's just the sheer volume of stressors and people and circumstances in urban space that make that much more likely to happen in that kind of space. I think that's the boring and probably most accurate answer. There's no kind of silver bullet, right? It's not tall buildings, right? It's not noise. It's some kind of combination of stressors. I mean, we should also remind ourselves, while acknowledging that this is absolutely unimpeachably true, there's a huge amount of invisible mental health problems in rural areas. I'm someone who comes from, a rural background, like a rural part of a rural country, and there's a huge amount of, what I would call madness in rural spaces that just goes completely under the radar, partly because there are just not the systems of surveillance. There are not the kind of services that people can access. I think in kind of rural areas, which are often more family oriented, it's a lot easier to manage stuff internally. So, we need to remind ourselves that there's a reason that things become visible in cities, right? I mean, famously, again, this is the thing that I say that I'm not sure is true. I'm not going to let that stop me saying it. I mean, famously, for a long time, the highest preponderance of schizophrenia in Europe was in a neighbourhood called Camberwell in South London. And of course, if you know London, what's also in Camberwell is the Maudsley Hospital, which is Europe's largest psychiatric research facility. And so all that is a story about visibility, right? It's a story about where there's the thing where people can see things, where they can look for things, where people can access services for things. There will be lots of that thing, right? That doesn't mean it's not real. Of course, those phenomena are very much present. It just means that it might not be the city as a phenomenon. It might be the stuff that's in the city that's at work.
Now, you didn't reference a lot of evolutionary psychology, but I think the evolutionary psychologist would fit right in here in saying that these large-scale urban agglomerations are in some way unnatural, right? So there's something about our Pleistocene ancestors. We loved to live out on the savannah, and I think you allude to this whole prospect and refuge philosophy. But this idea of nature as somehow good, I mean, that also has kind of relatively recent origins. I mean, the idea that you would go out into the forest and bathe your psyche. I mean, 500 years ago, that was where the bad wolf lived. You'd get eaten if you went out there. There's no way you're going to go out there and relax. You're going to be on your guard the whole time, right?
Yeah, I mean, genuinely, Greg, 50 years ago, I mean, it's really not, it is for almost all of human history, clumps of trees were things to be avoided, right? They're dark, bad things happen in there, there's animals in them. I mean, it is genuinely extremely recent that we've come to think of as forested, wooded spaces as, potentially peaceful, calm places you go to relax. That's an extremely weird idea, which doesn't mean it's wrong, but we should recognize that it's weird. And, I think that the fact that for most of human history, we've avoided forests in particular, often, and I think avoided also kind of, big empty parkland spaces, which lots of people find intimidating for fairly obvious reasons, should give us some clue that whatever is at stake in, whatever is making us feel now calm in those spaces is not necessarily capital N nature at work, right? It's not necessarily our deep evolutionary inheritance, because if it is, our deep evolutionary inheritance was not functioning particularly well until 20, 25 years ago. And again, to say that these things are kind of a bit social and a bit cultural and that they change over time is not to say that they're not real, right? I really do believe that people experience good psychological effects from forest bathing. I've been forest bathing a bunch of times. I'm kind of skeptical about it, but there's clearly people for whom it is doing good work and good for them, right? And so to say that there's something cultural going on, that people are bringing associations to that are kind of working well for them, is not to say it's not real or they shouldn't do it, right? But it is to say it's much more complicated than the evolutionary psychology story would have us believe, which is exactly as you put it, that we evolved to be in particular kinds of environments, and we need to at least make our cities look a bit more like those kind of environments, even if that just means putting more plants and animals around the place. That's the kind of typical biophilia story, which architects love, of course, right? It's because it just means they can work with plants, which they want to do anyway. But it seems to me it's going to be a much more complicated story than that.
Well, I mean, it seems like there's two ways that you could get access to nature. One is sort of set it over in some place where you can go and visit it, right? So I think John Muir was all about preserving the forests so that you could go and visit them. And then the other is to kind of mesh them, and so that there's no real clear boundary between urban and rural. And I think when I look at Corbusier, it's kind of hard when the kind of conventional notion of Corbusier is, concrete, brute, and tall skyscrapers, undistinguishable, units that are, I guess, tools for living, right? But he was actually steeped in this whole garden city movement as well, right? Just the idea was the way you maximize the amount of greenery was to pack the people as tight as possible, right?
Exactly so. I mean, I should say, like, I'm really loath and slow to defend Corbusier, who was, we should remind ourselves, a fascist and an anti-Semite and a very active Nazi collaborator. Right? I mean, that's the literature on Corbusier has really changed in the last 5 years. Even, I mean, I think we used to think of him as kind of someone who was a bit of a fellow traveler or who just kind of happened to be in Vichy during the war. I think now we know that he was pretty active anti-Semite and enthusiastic Nazi. So we should say that before we say anything kind of even vaguely generous about Corbusier. But it is true that this kind of idea we have about him, the stereotype of, as you say, the kind of uniform towers, really misses the point of what he thought he was doing. Because, of course, for Corbusier, the point of the towers was what was happening underneath, right? So what's this kind of image that many people will know is the famous Plan Voisin, which is Corbusier's attempt to basically level the center of Paris and build these, this kind of, I guess, Shanghai style kind of like uniform of tower blocks going across. Of course, what Corbusier cared about was not the tower blocks, it was the green stuff at the bottom, right? And if you read his kind of writings from the period, what he's interested in is, people planting vegetables at the bottom of towers. They come home from work and they play in the garden, then they get the lift up to their tower. It's still a terrible, right? But it's not at all hostile to nature, as we often think. There's a wonderful book by a historian called Peter Anker, who at least was at NYU until recently, if he's not still. It's called something like From Bauhaus to Eco House, but it's basically a reminder to us that particular moment in architecture, which we think of as like high modernist, right? So associated with kind of geometric shapes, kind of new artificial materials, all those sorts of things, was actually deeply interested in biology, in nature, in thinking about like humans as biological creatures which might need particular kinds of environments. Very famously, some of the Bauhaus architects, while they were exiled in London, designed spaces for London Zoo because it was thought that, like, as Bauhaus architects interested in like physical, natural environments, they would know how to design a penguin house. I mean, that turns out not to be true, but at least it tells us something of how they were thought of in their own period, right? Which was not at all these kind of, pave the forests, like build massive tower kind of high modernist. They were much more subtle than that.
Yeah, I mean, it seems odd that Corbusier's vision for Paris and the cities of Riverside and garden cities, that they come from the same movement, because they look radically different.
Yeah, they come from the same historical period and the same general urge, I would say. I mean, they obviously have there's different things going on there, right? I mean, Riverside, of course, is one particular kind of place that's associated with Frederico Olmsted and the Olmsted and I think Vaux or Vaux, I'm never sure, company. The Garden City movement in England, of course, goes through Ebenezer. I was going to say Ebenezer Scrooge, Ebenezer Howard, and Howard, like there was some famous architects involved in Garden Cities in England. So Lutyens was involved in Welland Garden City, the second Garden City. So they look quite different. They're obviously different kind of vernacular architectures, and I guess like different cultural accounts of like what a garden might look like in England and North America, which is itself kind of interesting, right? Because in England it's a very kind of twee, pastoral. I mean, if you go to like, I spent quite a bit of time in Welland. Welland, like it's a lovely place, right? You should say that. It's got these very nice little kind of timber framed terraced houses. I'm sure what someone from in North America would look like sheds, right? Tiny little places, but at least look to me like quite pleasant human sized places. So it's very twee, I would say even like Hobbit like vision, right? Of what a kind of garden looks like. And that obviously comes from
Thomas Kincaid painting, right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, the kind of the smoke and the kind of light coming out. Yeah. That obviously comes from a very distinctively like Victorian English cultural imagination, right? It's the same thing you see in this is where 8 p.m. catches me. William Morris, in kind of writings of William Morris, that same kind of slightly twee, like kind of faux medieval kind of vision, right? That there's an attempt to recreate the kind of little village hamlet or the medieval village hamlet. And obviously what Olmsted is doing is something quite different. Like what is it? the kind of landscapes that Olmsted is trying to interact with and recreate and play with are obviously like physically very different, but also the cultural imagination he's coming from, I think, is very different. So you get the same, let's say, the same like historical urge in two different places at the same time, but that play out quite differently. And of course, there's Garden City movements in Germany and in France that also have their own distinctive histories. Yeah.
Well, and some of these movements were led by employers, right? So
Yes.
Port Sunlight is an example of where an enlightened corporation decided to create housing for their employees. They were concerned about the health of their employees, but they also were concerned about the morals of their employees. And Henry Ford also famously was policing the behavior of his employees in his company town. But you went to visit this place, and you said you liked it a lot. I mean, these are not manual laborers living there now, right? I mean, these are now expensive houses full of upper middle class people, right?
Yeah, they are. I mean, Port Sunlight is the English geography is a little bit complex. So Port Sunlight is near a city called Liverpool. Liverpool is in the northwest of England. Liverpool is a fabulous city, but it's kind of historically not a very wealthy one. Maybe it's a bit like, I don't know, Detroit or in the kind of American imaginary, right? It's a great city, but like historically not wealthy. So these are kind of houses now that I guess teachers would live in, or you kind of like lower middle class people with decent jobs, as opposed to kind of Welwyn Garden City, which is about a 30-minute train ride from London, and those are millionaires' houses, right? So it's quite a different like demographic is living in those. I should say also about Port Sunlight, and this is where I need to be a small bit delicate, which is that the research for this book, and I say this in the book, was funded by the Leverhulme Trust. So the Leverhulme Trust is a research funder that comes out of a bequest from William Lever, who is the founder of Port Sunlight, a kind of a soap manufacturer, a kind of a cleaning products manufacturer, a hugely important major employer of his day, who in his will left a chunk of his cash for this Leverhulme Trust, which actually funded me to do the research. So, I mean, to their credit, this has not been a problem. I mean, I've written very critically about William Lever, and about what he was doing in the late 19th century. And I think, benign with a very small b, enlightened with a very small e would be the kindest way you could put it. And they've not raised that with me so far, at least. So much to their credit, but I do need to be at least a small bit delicate when we talk about William Lever. But yeah, so William Lever was a soap, like kind of a self-made, more or less self-made soap manufacturer. He was really a branding guy. So his soap wasn't particularly distinctive, but his packaging was fabulous. So his product was called Sunlight. And you can see that if you Google the advertisements, like he was the first person to put paper wrapping on his soap, so it looked distinctive. And he had these kind of very famous, very beautiful, often very problematic advertisements about kind of cleaning and hygiene, which obviously caught a public mood in late Victorian England. And he built a company town called Port Sunlight. And of course, that was a movement at the time. Other employers like Cadbury's, who were the kind of big Quaker chocolate manufacturers, built a town near Birmingham called Bourneville. There was one in Glasgow built by, there's another 8 p.m. thing, the name's gone, on the River Clyde. Anyway, in Glasgow, New Lanark, that's the name of it. So this was kind of a thing at the time, right? And it was partly an attempt to ameliorate what effectively was a non-existent welfare state, right? An attempt to ameliorate the fact that basically workers could not live well on what the wages that the factory owners were willing to pay them. So this was one way to deal with that, was to provide the kind of basics of living yourself. But of course, it's also about surveillance and about control. It's about the attempt to mold people, and William Lever was really explicit about this. He used images of the town in his branding, that kind of sense of hygienic, orderly products. It was very much part of his self-image. Lever was a big fan of Samuel Smiles, the kind of original self-help guru, the guy who invented the notion of self-help. And apparently, if you were a very high-performing worker, your reward was to be invited in to see Lever, and he would give you a copy of Smiles' book, Self-Help. So it's a very kind of, we should imagine it's a very Victorian kind of situation, right? Kind of self-help, bootstraps, cleanliness, good order, good moral hygiene, all those sorts of things, instantiated in urban design, in an attempt to really de-urbanize the city, if I can put it like that.
I teach this course on future of work, and a lot of it's about the workplace. And a lot of companies now, I mean, they seem very interested in this whole idea of environmental psychology, and they're trying to design workplaces to not only get productivity and collaboration and creativity from their employees, but also to kind of promote employee wellness. And so, particularly here in Silicon Valley, where it's a very competitive labor market, you see these campuses, Facebook and Google and Salesforce and so forth, and this idea that certain types of ways of thinking occur best in certain environments. I mean, this also has really old roots, doesn't it?
It does. I mean, what people like William Lever thought they were doing, I mean, much like Ebenezer Howard, was absolutely providing spaces that were good for well-being, that were good for people's health, that provided a nice place to live for workers. But they were definitely trying to like create people and like to intervene in like human genetics in a certain kind of way, right? So something I think I say in the book is that really we should think of the company town as a kind of like genetic and even maybe eugenic technology. And of course, Lever, like everyone of his age on the left and right, was a committed eugenicist. And like everyone of his age in England, he was someone deeply disturbed by the British Empire's loss in the Boer War. So the British lost the Boer War to essentially groups of what they thought of as kind of barely organized, rugged farmers, took on and really, challenged the what thought of itself as the British Empire at its height. And this produced a huge amount of public anxiety in England in particular about, what kind of people England was producing, like the quote unquote English stock was being, was degenerating, right? This was the kind of deeply eugenic and of course deeply racist discourse at the time. And the city was absolutely central to that anxiety, right? That there was something about urban life which was reducing the human stock of the kind of center of empire. So obviously that's not what folks in Silicon Valley think they're doing, right? There's obviously something very different happening there. But I think we should take seriously this attempt to kind of like, what we should take seriously is that attempts to kind of use space to mold people, even where it kind of looks on the surface good, is not necessarily good and is not necessarily coming from a nice philosophical place. I was trying to remind myself as you were talking, Greg, of the new city that's been proposed for quite close to where you are, right? So I think a bunch of tech billionaires have bought up land. I can't remember the name of it. So it made the news here because the Stripe brothers, who of course are the pride of Ireland, were involved in this endeavor. So it made it kind of as a funny news story here. But that too, I think we should take really seriously. I mean, of course, those folks don't have bad intentions, right? I'm quite convinced of that. But like, we should think seriously about the history of, people with enormous wealth and power, trying to think about how urban space can how intervening heavily in urban space can really have a transformative effect, right? Like, even the best of intentions, the history of that is pretty bad, right? That's pretty much always bad. So we deserve to be convinced about why it won't be bad this time, I think.
Well, when you were mentioning new urban planning projects, I thought you were going to talk about the line, right, in Neom. And it's so funny
the line is no more now. The line is like, the line is now a block.
I mean, I don't understand how this thing can be characterized as a green city. I mean, it makes no sense.
Well, it makes sense because it looks green, right? So, I mean, I think we should pay. I'm a sociologist by training, so I think we should pay sociological attention to architectural renders, right? Because I think architectural renders are a really interesting genre for how we imagine the future, and they're invariably extremely green, right? And that's why we think of Neom as a green city, because if you look at the renders, it looks extremely green, right? It looks like a forest with a little few houses poking out. I mean, it would take my 4-year-old like 1 minute to think about actually building a new city from scratch in a desert in the northwest of Saudi Arabia is not the most environmentally friendly thing to do right now, right? That's no one's vision of like sustainability, let alone any kind of account of how, the state of Saudi Arabia maintains itself, right? Like what the economy is. So very obviously, there's nothing that is environmentally good happening here. But I think it is interesting, and we should take seriously the fact that a space like that can still produce itself as in touch with nature, as kind of, I think they use a particular phrase in the material that I can't quite bring to mind, but it's, it's basically protecting the surrounding nature, right? And it's, the city is like, the idea was that it would have zero emissions and there would be no cars, it is this kind of fantasy of the kind of low energy future. Um, but it's obviously ludicrous, right? It takes 2 minutes to think about like that's ludicrous. We should say, I mean, the line is, it really is no more. So I think for a long time, so the idea was that the line would be a couple of 100 kilometers long. So for folks who don't know, the idea was that they were going to build two mirrored walls, a few 100 meters high, a couple of 100 kilometers into the desert. So it is what looks like basically a corridor, right, with about a kilometer wide. I think very obviously that was never going to happen, but like the fantasy was sustained to a like interestingly high degree. So I went to the Line show in Venice last year. So the folks behind the project rented space in Venice during the Venice Architecture Biennale and put on this very impressive show about what happened. They had extremely like kosher architects involved in it, and we had videos of these architects and their renders. Like the fantasy was, it was sustained for a long time, and then like sometime last year, satellite imagery of groundwork started to appear. Then suddenly people started thinking maybe this thing actually is going to happen. And I think finally, just last week, even so, I mean, so recently that I haven't really got up to speed with it. But last week, finally, it's radically reduced in scale. So what was going to be a city of 9 million, I think, is now going to be a city of about 300,000. What was going to be a couple of 100 kilometers, I'm not sure how many, but it's radically smaller than that. So I think they are clearly building something. They're not building a city, I think we can fairly say.
Well, going back to the movement in the early part of the 20th century, there was also this notion that what constituted natural differed from country to country. I mean, I did a podcast once where the British believed that the secret to Britishness was British beef, right? So, British people ate British beef, and that's how they became British people. And I think you mentioned that there were people that thought that British oak was the secret, right, to
Sure.
British strength,
Sure,
and
sure.
so you need to have oak everywhere.
Yeah, absolutely. And in Ireland, it's like the bog, right? So we actually have a big debate about this. So for a long time in Ireland, especially people in rural parts of the country, I mean, today named themselves with peat briquettes, right? So like literally like turf dug out of the ground. My grandmother heated her house like this until like 2 years ago, and literally you'd put this briquette into like an Aga style cooker, and that would heat your house for the day. And of course, this is an extremely environmentally unsustainable practice, and there's many attempts to like get people to stop doing this, and they won't stop doing it, even though there's like big financial incentives to stop, because there's a deep cultural investment in like that the kind of people we are the kind of people who dig this stuff out of the ground and like heat our homes with it. And I do think like a lot of I wrote this book while I was living in England, so a lot of the book is kind of about cultural history of trees basically. And I do think like the English have a very particular relationship with trees that they don't really think about. And the English oak as a kind of representative of, kingliness, of kind of solidity, of kind of, tallness and even domination, I would say, is very central to the English imaginary. And there's like something, I mean, I don't want to get too like pop psychology about it, but like there is something. So England and Ireland have the distinction of being two of the most deforested countries in the world, right? So I mean, there's literally no trees in Ireland. It's just like blank rolling hills. And England is a bit less deforested than Ireland, but much the same. There's something about like the combination of being that psychologically invested in the tree as a kind of national symbol, and that being that deforested as a nation, that I think does something odd to people in these islands. Yeah.
Well, there's also this idea that certain types of architecture, and it's usually some kind of traditional architecture, is seen as more natural in a way, right? So, King Charles is famous for his advocacy of kind of traditional architecture. And I mean, it's certainly the case that when you are in some of these old villages, I mean, there is something wonderful about them, right? And, there does seem to be something at human scale, which makes it in many ways a comfortable place to be. I mean, as long as the buildings aren't abandoned, and, they're all in good shape and so forth. I mean, so is this just sort of attaching natural to something that people like? Is it attaching? I'm sure that King Charles would probably say that if it's going to look traditional, it's got to look traditionally English. It's not going to look traditionally African or traditionally Chinese, right? He's going to advocate something that looks like a early modern Georgian-style English town.
Yeah, well, I think the Georgian-style is where things become a bit complicated. So, I mean, I should say, so I have no sympathy with King Charles as a good Irish Republican, but I do have some sympathy with the architecture. I think are decent people, trying to do an interesting kind of experimental job that actually is more interesting than its critics give it credit for. But I think precisely the problem is like, I can be sympathetic to the view that, there's a kind of, let's say, vernacular English architecture that is, just kind of good for the English person's soul. And, all things being equal, why don't we build in that style? Because why wouldn't you? That seems to be like an inoffensive kind of idea. But of course, you immediately run into like, which English vernacular are you talking about? And it's invariably, the early 1800s, right? That comes to stand in for Englishness, and we should think about why that is. Like Panbury is a genuinely like interesting and kind of uncanny place. And what makes it uncanny is that it's built in Georgian style, and of course, Georgian is quite a narrow period of time. You're talking about a few decades, but at the turn of the 18th and 19th centuries. But the houses are built to very high quality, actually, by very, very, extremely good traditional architects, but they're brand new. So there's something kind of uncanny about what we are used to reading as old, and always looks kind of old and a bit crumbly, but being now straight and new, as it would have looked, of course, to its original inhabitants. There's something uncanny about that. But also, of course, like,
so wait, they don't antique traditions. So they don't antique them, right? They don't antique. They don't go in there and start hacking at them and stressing them out, and like they do with jeans.
No, I mean, genuinely, to their credit, they don't, because they could do that. Like, it's not as Disney as people sometimes complain about it. I mean, the thing they do that's a bit Disney is they hide all the services. So, so everything is kind of accessed from the rear of the house. So you can't see any kind of, of course you can, but like, there's a little wiring as kind of and modern boxes as possible from the front of the house.
So you have
and
service,
that's of course for
you
general
have
aesthetic.
You have like servant entrances without servants.
No, by services I mean like utilities. So what you guys would call utilities. Yeah. So are all kind of at the back. Yeah.
anything that would have been anything that would have been invented after 1800, you mean, is stuck in the back.
Right. Yeah. No, I should be careful. They're not crude about it, but they definitely put all the utilities at the rear, right? It's always that's okay because those aren't beautiful things. But I think that is a kind of slightly antiquing kind of effect. But yeah, there are of course many like vernacular like English architectures, and I think I would insist that like there's nothing particularly un-English about the period of the kind of 1930s to 1970s, when actually most English housing was public housing. Overwhelmingly, it was the state that was building housing, and overwhelmingly it was building it in modern and often daringly modern style, right? So it's a period when English municipal governments had quite avant-garde architects working directly for them, like they were employed by the city or by the local authority, which is really interesting. And we're building often really daring, really interesting schemes, and that went on for some decades. So I think one thing we need to think critically about is why that doesn't think why I think of that as a kind of an English vernacular, right? That kind of mid 20th century public housing, which by the way a huge amount of the population of England grew up in, was transformational for the lives of a lot of people. Why that doesn't appear to us as vernacular English, but like the houses of the kind of lower gentry of the early 1800s, that feels to us distinctively English. That feels to King Charles as distinctively English. Again, I know it's kind of a boring refrain, and it's kind of a boring refrain from a sociologist, but it just seems to me very obvious that whatever's going on here, it's not nature, right? That there's history, culture, politics, I would say, and power kind of working its way through those things. And again, I keep saying this, I know, but like that doesn't mean it's bad, right? I'm not saying that means it has to be torn down, but I just think we should stop telling ourselves that what's happening here is a story about nature. If you like Georgian houses, like good for you, build a Georgian house. I have no problem with that. Where I have a problem is this idea that, that makes you a kind of psychologically and maybe morally better person, that's the kind of space we should all be living in because we're supposed to. That's where I get a little unhooked from it.
Well, now that is, when it comes to style, that's presumably where the folks with different maybe political inclinations, that's where they might divide their opinions. So the the fondness for traditional architecture, I think you say, is much more pronounced among people who are more conservative.
Yeah, I mean, there's a very particular movement that you mentioned, Roger Scruton, earlier. I mean, it goes through Roger Scruton's very early work from the 1970s. And, Scruton, to his credit, right, I'm someone who has no political sympathy with Scruton, but let's say to his credit, he was admirably explicit and clear about what he was saying. Right? Like, he really did think that Georgian houses were better for people, right? And he thought they would produce better people. And he really explicitly thought that modern 20th century buildings produced bad people, which is to say, if you grew up in one of those spaces, you were probably a bad person. Like, it might not be your fault, but you were probably a bad person. That really deep strain of thought that runs through English conservatism. And Scruton, again, let's give him some credit, was extremely successful in propagating his view, in kind of selling it to political figures. I think he got a bit lucky in that in the 1980s, when Margaret Thatcher was in power, there was a big general turn against social housing, a kind of a big economic interest in privatizing what was then the massive stock of public housing in the UK. And so a kind of a philosopher coming along and telling you, and by the way, this stuff is actually bad for people, was pushing on an open door, right? Because really they wanted to sell this stuff off anyway. So I think that's part of the story of how Scruton got so successful, but two, how certainly in the UK context, kind of let's say modernism gets associated with the left, and kind of more traditional gets associated with the right. That's partly a story about the economics of public housing in England in the 20th century. It was mostly Labour governments who built kind of modern, quick, big social housing estates, and most conservative governments who are very keen to sell them off. So it's kind of, I guess it's an economic split that gets like told through aesthetics, basically.
Now, in the book, you also talk about the whole psychological research domain of cognitive maps and spatial cognition. And this is a really interesting area of research. What I think you talked about Ed Tolman, who I think was a Berkeley professor. There's a building named after him here in Berkeley, and he put the rats in the cages and had them try to figure out, and they get confused and they get stressed. And you didn't mention this other guy named Zagons, who also played around with rats to try and figure out how they could solve mazes as a function of stress and so forth. And I always remember, I grew up in Philadelphia, and Philadelphia has a grid with numbered streets, like New York and like a lot of American cities, and Roman cities had that pattern. And I always found it wonderful, super easy to get around. I knew where everything was. I didn't need to have a huge hippocampus like you do if you want to be a taxi driver in London. I mean, you can get fresh off, even before Google Maps, you could get fresh off the boat and become a cab driver, and somebody would say, go to 19th and Spruce. And if you're at 18th and Walnut, it was like, no problem. And so, I mean, but in a way that's almost like that's a much more artificial environment than these European cities that kind of grow up organically. And so our cognitive load is lower in a place that seems more artificial. How does that make sense?
Yeah, and I think, I think that's right. The cognitive load is lower. The cognitive work is easier, and I think there's some suggestion that one of the effects of that is that has bad effects on dementia. That the kind of the cognitive labor of memory in navigating a European city has some kind of preventative effect against at least cognitive decline, let's say, if not dementia in later life. That's at least a suggestion for sure. But I mean, like, so I think in particular, so there's the history of spatial cognition, as you mentioned, that goes through exactly Tolman's very early rat experiments, which are extremely interesting. But then goes through the discovery of place cells decades later. And, one of the reasons that kind of Tolman is so famous now is because place cells have become so kind of important for neuroscientists. So there's a kind of retrospective reading of Tolman back into that story as the kind of originator of, spatial cognition. But, sorry, this is now like late in the evening. I'm just like not functioning. So let me say that a bit better. And I think something that is becoming really interesting in this space is the emergence of especially environmental neuroscience, as I think a relatively new and relatively increasingly interesting and powerful discipline. Environmental neuroscience has a kind of it exists for a whole bunch of reasons, but certainly the increasing sense that we're able to take a brain measure while a person moves around the space in 3 dimensions. Like I think it's something that can be done imperfectly now. It's still very much in progress, but at least we have a horizon in which that's going to become, pretty possible at kind of high resolution research grade relatively soon. And that is transformative, actually. That if we can truly, if the 3 dimensions of a space become truly available as a variable for brain measurement, then something does happen and something does change in that moment. I mean, something that's, I've started to write about this a little bit. I've contributed to kind of a chapter on the history of environmental neuroscience to what I think is the first handbook of environmental neuroscience that's coming out next year. But one of the things that's really struck me about it is like how environmental neuroscientists are telling exactly the same story about like nature and trees and cities as we've known since like the early 19th century, to the point where I think one paper I did kind of a quick review, but one paper refers to the discipline as the cognitive neuroscience, right? That's really what's being invented here. So that's again interesting that like another turn in this wheel, we're still telling more or less the same story with kind of different measures and different research paradigms, but still, the same story, which is that it's good for us to be in contact with nature. It's not particularly good for us to spend all our time surrounded by tall buildings. We're still there.
Now, in the book, I'm going to make you defend some things you said in the book, because one thing you said you didn't like Copenhagen. And Copenhagen always shows up.
No, I'm fine with
that. It always shows up on the top of the list of, best places to live. And then you say you don't like Paris. I mean, I think I forget who it was, said, if you don't love Paris, you don't love life. So, right. But I think it was the mayor of Paris who announced recently that they were going to plant like 10,000 trees. So, the other thing I think you're going to have to defend is what the heck is wrong with planting lots of trees, because every mayor in the world is coming out in favor of planting trees all over the place.
Well, let me defend two different things that I feel comfortable about. So one is Paris. I mean, Paris is an absolute dump, and I feel absolutely like it's uncomplicated for me to defend that. I mean, like as everyone of course will know, Paris is a city that was created by Baron Haussmann, by Louis Napoleon, the nephew of the original Napoleon, in the middle of the 19th century. It was, explicitly designed by a fascist madman in order to kind of quell civil unrest and level the kind of beautiful medieval city of Paris. So the idea that this, fascist dreamscape has become our kind of like go-to vision of urban romance is like interesting to me and something we should think about. I should say, like, I really hate the spatialization of Paris. So I lived in London for a long time. And one of the lovely things about living in London is that you can get to Paris in about 2.5 hours by train. And if you do that, the nice thing is you get a real sense of the geometry, because of course you come in from the outskirts and the outskirts are very visible. And what you see in the outskirts, of course, are these huge towers, right? The ones that are familiar to us from Corbusier, which are mostly lived in by people of color, by working class people, by migrants, who are kept very carefully away from the kind of beautiful Amélie-style Parisian center, right? Which in London, for all its faults, is not something you get. That very strict segregation spatialization doesn't really exist. That's quite a Parisian thing. So I feel pretty comfortable about my Paris hate, I've got to say. It's just, that's fine with me. On the trees, I mean, I don't really hate the planting of trees. I'm even like tentatively in favor of it. I think what concerns me about urban tree planting is I guess what we're not talking about when we're talking about urban trees, right? So the amount of kind of social and public problems that like trees are meant to solve is ridiculous, right? It's everything from kind of mental health to like youth crime to like skills in some part of England where they're planting trees in like an English town because it's like the people of the town have low skills for some reason.
It's a panacea.
Like it just seems, right? It just seems to go to for just not tackling boring social problems, right? So for instance, I think it's very real that there are major mental health problems in cities. I think there is something very serious about the way we have constructed the contemporary city that it's just bad effects for lots of people. But it seems to me if you wanted to really tackle that and take it seriously, you'd be looking at stuff like housing security, precarious labor, You'd be looking at what kind of condition migrants are living in. You'd be looking at how you can get around the city. The kind of boring bread and butter of kind of urban life that we've known about for centuries. And that, of course, mayors don't really want to deal with because it's complicated, time consuming, expensive, and unpopular. So what do? You plant trees, and that's how you resolve these issues. So it's not the trees in themselves. It's like, I guess, the opportunity cost of like tree planting in terms of, at least, even if we're not going to do these things, let's at least talk about them, right? Let's recognize that, probably a reason that lots of people are unhappy in a city like London or New York is a lot to do with how difficult it is to live there, right? How difficult it is to make rent, how difficult it is to live security, all those sorts of things. Let's at least talk about that and not just like, think the trees are going to solve everything.
So it's lipstick on a pig, basically. So what are your favorite cities?
I mean, even I didn't compare it to pigs. That one's on you. So people ask me this. I'm like, I don't have favorite cities. I mean, so being really serious, I like crap cities, and I like what I often think of as second and third tier cities. So, I think this is kind of semi-serious. Like when we talk about cities and urban life, we always talk about like New York, Shanghai, London, a kind of a small set of like massive, hugely cosmopolitan and, beautiful. Like I'm a big fan of all of those cities, but like that is not urban experience, right? People who live in cities do not live in London and Shanghai. They live in like places I'm in, Cork, right? Which is a kind of a provincial post-industrial city of 100,000 people. It's got some good stuff going on for it. It's got some bad stuff going on for it. It's kind of trying in various ways to pick itself up. That is your modal urban experience, right? That's people who live in cities live in Cork. They don't live in London or Shanghai. And so, like, there's something about we need to stop centering urban discourse on the kind of charismatic megafauna of like global urbanism, right? And look at the kind of what I would genuinely call the crap cities, right? The kind of second tier, slightly struggling places. Your places like Cork, Cardiff in Wales, where I used to live. Like, I'm not sure what your go-to North American examples would be, but I'm sure those kinds of like lower tier, maybe Poughkeepsie, Peoria, these kind of places. That's your kind of modal urban experience, I think, and those are places I think we need to take much more seriously culturally and socially.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Now, last thing I want to ask you, I'm from Philadelphia, and I think a lot of people would call that a crap city, but I really liked it, even though it was dangerous and
charismatic.
There's a joke about.
Well, Pittsburgh, maybe.
The joke was first prize a week in Philadelphia, second prize 2 weeks in Philadelphia, right? That was the this joke. But I want to ask you, like, you're a professor of medical humanities, and I wanted to just get some insight into what this is and if this is kind of a growth area. I remember when I was at University of Virginia, they started doing poetry classes and art classes for doctors, and and of course, it used to be called the medical arts. It wasn't considered a science the way we think of it as a science until fairly recently. So, what exactly are the medical humanities, and what's this field focused on at the moment?
Well, I mean, that's exactly it. So, I mean, I think for a long time we've had this kind of attempt to get the humanities into, especially medical education, and there's this kind of slightly romantic, I suspect, slightly wrong. Yeah, exactly. You get doctors reading poetry or reading novels, and that would make them much more sensitive to like patient narratives, to kind of the complexity of illness, all those sorts of things. I mean, I think that's well-meaning and probably wrong-headed. But like I guess like everything in academia, it became a beast over time. And at a certain point, I think there was some kind of growing consensus that this interaction between humanities work and medical schools could maybe get out of the teaching domain and maybe get into research collaboration a little bit more. And that's, I think, really where the medical humanities comes from. So especially in a British context, I mean, people may know the Wellcome Trust is a kind of major life science funder. The Wellcome Trust has always funded the humanities as well. It's always had a little humanities stream for things like medical history, bioethics, those sorts of things. And at a certain point in its history, I mean, I hope I'm kind of dependent on the medical Wellcome Trust. I hope I'm not saying something bad. I certainly don't intend to. But at a certain point in its history, I think the Wellcome Trust decided we want to fund historians and philosophers. It also wanted to see serious, like, interdisciplinary research from literary scholars, from poets, from artists, from others in that space, from social scientists like me, from kind of anthropologists, people like that. I think the medical humanities was the kind of blanket term that was an attempt to bring all these things together, but really is an attempt to describe anything within the humanities, and the humanities in the broadest sense of that term, that is in whatever way trying to contribute to medical knowledge, to how we think about health, to how we live with the illness, I guess, in an interdisciplinary humanities type way. So, a lot of the field passes through what in Europe we call ELSI, or ethical, legal, social implications. So I'm sure you have the same thing in places like the NSF, but the big like EU funders, any large science grant is going to have what they call an ELSI chunk of it, ethical, legal, social implications. And that's really been, that's really sustained this field over a couple of decades. So basically every big science project has to have a philosopher, basically, which has been really good news for philosophy for some time. But now I think what folks in the field are trying to do is do something a little bit more collaborative and a little bit more imaginative, and not just have the philosopher who will sign off your ethics forms, but actually trying to think seriously about how like philosophy can inform experimental design, how philosophical work can itself be informed by stuff that's happening in biology and the life sciences, and trying to really get at, the kind of complex between space between those things where, you're doing work that is not quite humanities, not quite science, but some kind of magic third thing. Like always with these things, that doesn't really work out, but like the dream is worth sustaining.
Well, do you think doctors in the NHS will start prescribing forest baths and maybe prescriptions like, hey, get out of your city and go in the country, or go plant some trees, or I mean, how would this be incorporated into medical care?
So that is literally happening. So in England, they have a big move towards what they call green social prescribing. So we have social prescribing here, which is really an attempt to kind of, get some kind of low-level social intervention before you get medicalized, basically. And that's partly an attempt to kind of be nice, right? So like, if someone is having like a stressful life experiences, or they're lonely, or they're feeling low, like maybe they don't need a pill, maybe you can hook them up with like a book group or a gardening initiative or something, right? So that comes from a fairly nice place. It's also, of course, about cutting costs, because it's much cheaper to send someone to a walking group than it is to put them on, several years worth of pharmaceuticals in a public health system, which of course operates by rationing, because that's how public health systems work, right? You basically have to draw a line between, like, you're basically, below this line, no one's getting anything. That's essentially how it works, unfortunately. So that gives a big incentive to keep costs low, which in turn is driving a big move towards green social prescribing. So genuinely, there are bits of England, because the health system is kind of devolved by area, but there certainly are bits of England where you will go to your physician and you will say, I'm experiencing really low mood, I'm feeling anxious, I'm not having a good time at home. But when I was a kid, I felt a lot better. And I think that had a lot to do with the fact that we had a big garden, or we lived near a forest, and, I kind of missed that time in my life. And your physician can direct you to what in England they call a link worker. And that link worker will hear your story and will say, well, here's 5 gardening initiatives you can join. So that is a real thing that is happening. Whether or not that's good is like a separate question. But I do think, like, certainly in situations where like health rationing is reality, and it is in most European countries, that's definitely a big part of it.
Yeah, I think we're a long way from seeing that in the American healthcare system. But Des, thanks so much for joining me. The book is called The Living City, for those of you in the US, and it's called The City of Today is a Dying Thing, for those of you in Europe. Thanks so much.
Unsiloed podcast is produced by University FM, elevating the stories of your institution.